deux figures, les seules des figures possibles, c'est des objets et des propositions. Est-ce qu'il n'y aurait pas d'autres choses? Parce qu'à la limite, on peut dire ça reste quand même assez classique. On a des objets et des propositions.
Mais sauf dans, je sais pas qu'on appelle classique, tu vois, oui, c'est vrai, Euclide c'est classique, mais ce que pas habituel peut-être que normalement, bien sûr, on a proposition en objets qui sont, je sais pas, qui sont mentionnés dans proposition, oui, qui fait partie. Donc, dans ce cas-là, standard, peut-être pas classique, proposition est une espèce d'enveloppe pour objet. Et c'est ça qui n'est pas vrai ici. On verra dans Roth, là c'est intéressant parce que tu as objet à niveau, je sais pas, 0 ou 2, comme Voevodsky le compte. Donc avec chaque objet, on a certaines propositions associées, on peut dire. Mais il y a une partie des structures d'objets qui n'est pas dans les propositions, qui est vraiment objet.
Objet pur.
Oui, objet pur. Mais je peux dire comment, j'expliquerai la prochaine fois avec plus de détails, mais c'est que, par exemple, dans ce carré Howard classique, on a cette idée que type peut être proposition. Oui. Et c'est vraiment, à mon avis, c'est une question, parce que c'est un peu comme rule of thumb, mais il n'y a pas vraiment de justification. Qu'est-ce que ça va dire? Mais dans ce cas-là, homotopique, on voit que si chaque type, à certain sens, peut être conçu comme proposition, mais après tu as terme qui, dans le sémantique de théorie de preuve classique, Martin Löf, etc., termes de ce type est pauvre. Oui. Et si tu as plus qu'un, tu as deux termes. Voilà, par exemple. Donc, ça, c'est quelque chose qui fait partie d'autres structures, si tu veux. Oui. C'est-à-dire, pour proposition, ce que compte, est-ce qu'il y a une preuve ou non dans cette sémantique. Oui. C'est un peu comme vrai ou faux. Mais est-ce que tu as deux ou trois, ou est-ce qu'il y a une structure pour compliquer des preuves? Ça, c'est quelque chose qui peut être donné en forme aussi propositionnelle, bien entendu. Mais c'est que dans ce cas-là immédiat, ça ne fait pas partie de cette proposition. Donc pour faire proposition, il faut juste truncation, comme on dit en français. Couper.
Oui. Il n'y a pas de verbe, mais...
Oui, mais couper, on tronquer toute cette structure supérieure. Donc, et cette structure supérieure est là, si tu veux, pas propositionnelle. Même, bien sûr, tu peux tronquer et tu peux prendre prochain niveau chaque fois encore comme espace de passe, encore comme proposition d'autres lettres.
Ça, c'est la théorie des types, mais les types d'identité, ça existe dans la théorie de Martin Löf.
Oui.
Les types d'identité, donc à propos des preuves elles-mêmes, à propos des termes.
Oui, bien sûr.
C'est des propositions.
Oui.
Enfin, je fais des types, quoi.
Oui.
Donc la structure du fait qu'il y a deux preuves, plusieurs preuves, enfin, on peut en rendre compte dans la théorie des types elle-même.
Mais c'est vrai, mais si tu as une sorte de... Mais chaque fois, tu es obligé de couper, tu vois. Si tu veux tout rendre en proposition, tu coupes chaque fois. Et tu peux couper à niveau plus supérieur, bien sûr, tu vois. Mais si tu veux regarder toute cette structure entière, si tu veux, oui. À ces cas-là, tu peux dire, voilà, il y a un niveau propositionnel, il y a structure supérieure. Et donc, au lieu de parler proposition, type comme proposition, propositions as types, on parle de propositions as some types, certains types. Donc là, et là c'est intéressant parce que je crois il n'y a pas encore version standard, mais quand même il y a plusieurs variantes intéressantes de dire quel type est type de proposition. Mais quand même il y a, à mon avis, réponse assez évidente. pour ça. Peut-être il y a aussi d'été, mais voilà.
Enfin, je peux juste poser une question sur le plongement.
Mais ça, je la prochaine fois avec vraiment technique. Comme ça, c'est...
Parce que si tu dis, en gros, c'est pas la théorie homotopique des types, oui, c'est pas la théorie homotopique des types. La seule théorie qui soit la théorie homotopique des types, c'est la théorie homotopique des types, avec une idée très particulière. Ce que je veux dire, c'est que quel est le rapport entre le fait d'introduire des catégories supérieures, enfin d'avoir ça en tête quand on fait quand on présente la logique, et l'approche génétique. Ce que tu as l'air de dire, en gros, il faut une théorie logique qui soit axiomatisée et génétique, ou axiomatique et génétique.
Tout à fait.
D'accord. En quoi la théorie homotypique des types est-elle la seule façon d'introduire une approche génétique? Et en quoi
c'est pas le seul.
Oui. En quoi apporte-t-elle quel est le rapport entre introduire différents niveaux introduire différents niveaux pour justement ne plus tronquer et adopter une approche génétique? C'est pas pareil.
Mais c'est parce que dans la théorie du type, et même dans Martin Löf, déjà, oui, tu as des règles, il n'y a pas d'axiome, mais il y a plusieurs règles. Oui, la règle constructive. Et les règles, c'est tel que tu peux les appliquer aux propositions. Donc tu peux penser de ce règle et de règles d'inférence, logique au sens habituel. Mais aussi, tu peux appliquer ces règles, et c'est dans la théorie, pour ce type supérieur. Et à la même temps. Et donc, à ces cas-là, tu dis, voilà, il y a un niveau propositionnel qui correspond à cette troncation à un niveau 0, mais il y a aussi structure supérieure. Ce que on peut dire génétique. Mais c'est génétique, c'est vraiment important, je ne sais pas, philosophiquement, parce que je crois ce que vraiment, le défaut de cette approche Hilbert, c'est l'idée que tout objet est simple. Tu vois, tu peux avoir une proposition compliquée, etc., mais tu gères tes objets que par proposition, par description, comme par ça. Tu vois, et il n'y a pas de place pour cette structure de générer objets directement.
Et quels sont les objets générés en fait?
Dans Utopie des Pitiés.
Ou dans Martin Löf, ou dans...
De type supérieur, quoi. Bien sûr, chaque type supérieur, tu peux regarder comme type simple. Si tu oublies, tu vois, cette troncation négative, si tu peux appeler ça. C'est vrai. Donc, si tu veux, le cas très simple, on a plusieurs preuves, voilà, et on a structure de pattes, chemin entre les preuves, ça, qui n'est pas trivial.
C'est le type d'identité, ça.
Oui, oui. D'accord. Et à ce moment, tu peux dire, d'accord, ce qui m'intéresse à ce moment, c'est le chemin. Je m'intéresse plus de ce niveau 0. Et l'espace de chemin, bien sûr, c'est type que tu peux regarder comme... Tu peux regarder chaque chemin comme plan, si tu veux. Bien sûr, c'est trivial. Mais ce que pas trivial, c'est regarder les deux niveaux à la même temps, ou 3 ou plus niveaux à la même temps, tu vois. Et si tu les regardes à la même temps, ça change. À ce moment, tu dis, la proposition, c'est ce niveau-là, et tout autre, c'est déjà objet, pas propositionnel.
Je ne comprends pas très bien en quoi des types supérieurs, ce sont des objets et pas des propositions.
J'ai la même question.
Non, mais ça, en fait, ce que je dis maintenant, c'est pas mon avis à moi, c'est quelque chose dans le book, comme Utopie, etc. Donc, dans ces communautés, ça, c'est classique. Il n'y a pas autre chose qui est à moi, mais ça, c'est pas à moi. C'est ça exactement l'idée. Chaque espace, chaque type supérieur, tu peux oublier pas aussi les structures supérieures, mais les structures inférieures aussi. Et si tu oublies structure inférieure, donc chaque type, n'importe quel supérieur, il devient aussi simple. Oui? Chaque chemin est point. Mais les trucs de ne pas faire ça, les trucs de regarder point comme point et chemin comme chemin. Bien sûr, il y a cette relativisation. Et ça, c'est intéressant. Mais cette relativisation ne tue pas la structure de 2 niveaux élémentaires, ou 3 niveaux élémentaires. Tu vois, tu peux le bouger selon cet escalier, mais si tu regardes chaque fois qu'un seul niveau, ça c'est limite, tu vois. Et les trucs pas trivial, regarder quelques niveaux, peut-être infini, à la même temps. Ça c'est pas trivial. Et là, tu seras obligé de faire distinction, qu'est-ce qu'il y a proposition, qu'est-ce qu'il n'y a pas.
Non mais en fait, notre question c'est en quoi ça correspond à une genèse d'objets. Parce que quand Hilbert parle de méthode génétique, c'est pour construire des objets mathématiques au sens, classique, enfin je veux dire basique du terme. Donc là, quels sont les objets construits
mais jeudi,
au sens basique du terme?
Mais à jeudi, séminaire de Gabriel, je vais donner exemple très physique de Frege, de Vénus. Donc, tu as, je sais pas, les points, objets, morning star, evening star, c'est 2 points. Ouais. Et structure supérieure, c'est le chemin. Et après, si tu as, je sais pas, tu peux imaginer, c'est pas dans la mécanique classique, bien sûr, mais tu peux imaginer encore structure supérieure, utopique entre les chemins, etc. Ça sera quelque chose comme Feynman, intégral, etc. Donc, je serai. Et ça sera vraiment objet. Et pourquoi c'est pas un objet? Mais c'est que peut-être fait difficulté, et c'est vrai question, vrai problème, que quelque chose comme logique, on commence à regarder comme objet géométrique, tout à fait. Mais à ce cas-là, tu dois distinguer que certains objets géométriques, ça c'est générique pour cette approche, oui. Tout est géométrie. Mais dans ces géométriques, tu peux dire qu'est-ce qu'il y a en proposition. Parce qu'il y a les trucs qui sont proposition, et la définition standard, c'est un type avec ou vide ou avec un seul habitant. Ça sera une proposition.
Il me semble que la difficulté, elle vient aussi du rapport entre méthode génétique et méthode constructive. C'est-à-dire, en fait, quand Hilbert il parle de méthode génétique, il prend un sens précis des constructions qui ne colle pas vraiment avec ce dont tu as parlé chez Euclide, à proprement parler. C'est la réponse que tu m'as faite. Et donc, quelque part, il faudrait peut-être pas parler de méthode génétique du tout. C'est-à-dire que Hilbert, il laisse une place à la méthode constructive qui est le cas particulier des méthodes génétiques, mais en fait, ce que tu veux faire est plus large. Parce que c'est vrai que chez Hilbert, la méthode génétique, elle construit, en fait, c'est l'opposition qu'il fait, et tu as bien dit que c'était pas ça chez Euclide, et en termes d'existence. C'est-à-dire, ou bien j'ai des énoncés d'existence dans le cadre axiomatique, ou bien je construis des objets existants avec la méthode génétique. Mais ce que tu as dit sur Euclide, c'est que précisément sur Euclide, c'est pas comme ça.
Oui, je crois que Hilbert aussi ne fait pas comme ça. Ça je trouve pas. Non, déjà sur.
Les exemples que tu as pris, c'est-à-dire les coupures de Dedekind ou les suites de Cauchy, sont des objets qui sont construits. Là, les objets existent par la méthode de leur construction. Et uniquement comme ça. Après, je peux les traiter comme je veux, mais il n'y a pas de définition. Or, l'exemple, c'est exactement la discussion qu'on a eue. C'est-à-dire que tu as dit, non mais attention, chez Euclide, et ça, je suis d'accord avec ça. Chez Euclide, c'est pas comme ça, parce que si on commence à dire que les objets n'existent que s'ils ont été construits selon certaines règles, on a énormément de problèmes chez Euclide. Et donc chez Euclide, on a un mélange entre des constructions, au sens basique du terme, et des définitions, qui aussi jouent un rôle. Et donc je pense que ça embrouille un petit peu le point de vue de Hilbert par rapport à ce que dit sur Euclide, c'est quand même différent.
Attends, mais je crois que le différent de mon avis de toi, que quand tu dis ces constructions qui donnent existence, on est d'accord sur construction, mais on n'est pas d'accord peut-être avec existence. Tu n'as pas besoin d'existence, du tout. Tu vois, tu construis, mais parler d'existence, c'est autre chose.
Non, ce que je veux dire, c'est qu'un nombre réel, dans la méthode génétique, n'est rien d'autre qu'une coupure de Dedekind. Ou un nombre réel n'est rien d'autre que la limite d'une suite de Cauchy. Or, un cercle, chez Euclide, est autre chose que sa construction, sinon, il serait impossible de dire déterminer le centre d'un cercle. Ça n'aurait aucun sens, parce que par définition, un cercle ne sert rien d'autre que la construction à partir d'un centre et du cercle. C'est ça ce que tu m'as répondu, et moi je suis d'accord, absolument d'accord, parce que beaucoup de gens, quand ils lisent la géométrie d'Euclide en termes constructifs, et c'est le terme qu'ils utilisent, que ce soit Marco, que ce soit John, etc., ils réinterprètent les axiomes d'une vraie manière génétique, et ils disent les objets n'existent que selon des règles de construction. Et on a des problèmes insurmontables, et notamment à cause des problèmes, c'est ce que l'objection que je t'aurais fait depuis longtemps, à cause des démonstrations par l'absurde, où en fait, précisément, tu construis des choses que tu ne peux pas construire. Donc je pense que Hilbert, il relie ça à sa sauce, en mettant une autre opposition, celle entre méthode axiomatique et méthode génétique, c'est un rapport, mais c'est pas exactement la même chose. Et je pense que là...
mais déjà, moi, je base sur mon approche, pas sur Hilbert de 1900, Hilbert et Bernays 1934.
Ouais, mais là aussi, j'ai trouvé que c'est assez confus aussi ce qu'ils disent, parce qu'ils jouent un peu sur les différents tableaux. Je ne sais pas si c'est une bonne idée, c'est-à-dire qu'ils font des oppositions, mais qui sont moins précises que ce que tu as... Moi, je trouve que ce que tu as dit chez Euclide, et ça engendre ce type de questions, c'est-à-dire que il y aurait un sens plus large de méthode d'axiomatique constructive qui s'appliquerait plus facilement aux exemples que tu vas présenter la prochaine fois, que de vouloir vraiment que ça soit génétique au sens de Hilbert. C'est pas sûr que ça va coller au sens génétique strict. Enfin, c'est l'impression que j'ai dans les questions qui sont posées là. Or, en fait, t'as pas besoin. T'as pas besoin que ça soit génétique. Non. Toi, tu veux juste que ça soit constructif dans un sens qui est plutôt celui d'Euclide. Si j'ai bien compris.
Oui. Non, tu as tout à fait raison, mais je prends, oui, tu as raison que c'est trop vague, mais moi, je crois, en 1934, quand on cite Euclide, il cite Newton, je crois que c'est compatible. Et je suis tout à fait d'accord, bien sûr. Ça, c'est bon point, tu fais, sur s'il y a quelques définitions de nombril, sauf... ouais, peut-être.
Non, parce que tu vois, par exemple, la citation de 34, en fait, Jan Müller, quand il commente Euclide, il s'appuie sur Hilbert pour dire, vous voyez, en fait, on sait bien que c'est pas la même chose, etc. Et il reprend les mêmes exemples, c'est-à-dire, on n'a pas besoin de domaine d'objet donné à l'avance dans la géométrie d'Euclide. Okay. Et Marco, il dit la même chose. Il dit, on n'a pas de tous les triangles, on n'a pas de tous les cercles. Mais il y a des cas où c'est faux. Et John a écrit un article très beau là-dessus, c'est-à-dire, quand tu dois prendre un point au hasard dans le plan, tu dois le faire parfois chez Euclide, bah, tu es bien embêté, parce que ce point n'est pas construit, et tu prends un point au hasard, et ça, John, il a montré ça dans un article, on peut discuter cet article, mais c'est intéressant ce qu'il a pointé. Il y a un certain nombre de propositions d'apprendre un point au hasard, et là, on voit mal comment on fait si on n'a pas un ensemble de points dans lequel on en prend un. Voilà. Parce que les points ne sont pas construits, ne sont pas à l'avance, et celui qu'on prend au hasard n'est pas construit non plus. L'exemple type étant, par une droite, un point à l'extérieur de cette droite, tracer une perpendiculaire, et lui, il a rencontré ces difficultés pour des problèmes techniques. Parce que comme il avait un point de vue constructif, c'est très beau cet article qu'il a écrit dans Synthèse, il avait des problèmes techniques parce qu'en fait, comme tous ces objets étaient donnés par des constructions, eh bien quand tu veux faire certaines propositions, ça ne marche plus. Donc je pense que c'est vraiment intéressant, c'est-à-dire que même Hilbert 1934, c'est une certaine vue sur Euclide qui n'a pas vocation à être historiquement très fidèle, et je pense que ce que tu as répondu avant est plus fin. C'est plus fin, c'est-à-dire que chez Hilbert, on a des constructions, on a des considérations avec les définitions, on les mélange. C'est pas clair comment ça marche exactement, personne ne sait très bien comment ça marche. Et en tout cas, c'est autre chose que pure génétique ou pure axiomatique. C'est une sorte de mélange intéressant.
Mais écoute, déjà pour moi, ça semble une bonne idée de faire ensemble. C'est bon.
Oui, mais je suis d'accord. Enfin, je veux dire, c'est ça, il me semble que c'est ça.
Mais par contre, les questions pour moi, quand tu dis, je suis absolument d'accord sur ce point, mais est-ce que si on a définition de cercle, et tu as raison qu'on ne peut pas dire que ce prérequis de dire quelque chose sur un cercle, de le construire, je suis d'accord. Mais est-ce que c'est nécessaire, dans notre forme, d'assumer que ça existe? Quelque chose comme ça. Peut-être il y a autre modalité encore.
Ouais, ça, je suis d'accord. Non, je pense que c'est Hilbert qui pose ça en termes d'existence. Je pense que c'est Hilbert qui pose une question centrale, c'est la question des énoncés existentiels. Et en fait, je suis d'accord avec toi. On ne s'occupe pas du tout de ça dans la géométrie clinique. En fait, c'est Proclus qui a inventé ça. Proclus, il dit la raison pour laquelle ça commence par des problèmes, c'est parce qu'on ne peut pas parler de quelque chose si on n'a pas d'abord construit. Proclus qui a inventé cette interprétation de Euclide. Oui. Et Mick, il reprend ça tout le temps. Et je lui dis, le problème, c'est que ça ne marche pas tout le temps. C'est une interprétation de Proclus qui est assez jolie pour expliquer pourquoi il y a des problèmes d'abord, mais il y a plein de cas où ça ne marche pas, dans Euclide. Et donc, c'est une lecture qui existe depuis l'Antiquité tardive et qui a été reprise après à n'en plus finir en fait. Mais si on analyse Euclide, ça marche pas bien. Et il y a un papier d'Orna Hari là-dessus, justement, où elle dit c'est pas possible d'analyser.
C'est pas mon avis.
Non, mais c'est ça que je pense. Je pense qu'il faut se débarrasser de cette question de l'existence complètement, en fait. Et le voir autrement, voir comme une machine qui fonctionne d'une certaine façon, mais pas nécessairement avec des requisites d'existence.
C'est pour ça que la question que je posais, c'était si le non propositionnel est nécessairement de l'ordre de l'objet. Parce que ce qui est non propositionnel est nécessairement de l'ordre de l'objet. Parce que la définition de Hilbert sur le génétique porte sur des objets. On construit des objets à partir des objets. Et si je comprends bien, ce que tu cherches à faire, c'est bon, ça on le retrouve en théorie homotopythétique. Sauf qu'il y a quelque chose de la construction ou du génétique, mais pas forcément des objets.
Mais quel terme tu utilises?
Justement, c'est ça toute la question. Mais j'ai un peu la sensation, mais je ne sais pas, je pose la question, que lorsque tu dis on peut toujours couper, même quand tu dis troncage négatif, on projette sur des objets de la même façon qu'on peut projeter des types sur des propositions. Mais avant de projeter sur des objets, avant de faire des schémas des points par exemple, et de rendre les schémas des points, ce n'est pas des objets, c'est d'autres choses qui ne sont pas forcément des objets dans le sens d'existence dont on parle tout à l'heure. C'est quelque chose comme des structures, disons, pour dire quelque chose comme ça.
Mais écoute, le terme objet, pour moi, en fait, c'est très kantien. Tu vois, c'est objet vraiment dans le sens kantien, et c'est tous les soucis de Cassirer, par exemple, qui dit à Russell qu'il n'y a pas les bonnes notions objet dans ce cadre, etc. C'est tout là. C'est-à-dire, c'est objet qui, comme sa forme, si tu veux, a les règles de construction. Donc c'est objet, mais règles de construction dans le sens pas large. Donc c'est objet dans ce sens-là. C'est quelque chose qu'on construit selon les règles fixes. Et je crois, pour un historique, c'est bien appeler ça objet.
Je vois par exemple ce que David
c'est objectif, ça donne sens d'être objectif selon ce système de règles.
Mais par exemple, les règles elles-mêmes ne sont pas forcément des objets. Et si je comprends bien, c'est ce que David dit. C'est-à-dire qu'il s'agirait de penser, je ne sais pas comment tu viens de le dire, mais un machin qui fonctionne par rapport à Euclide. Il y a des définitions, il y a des constructions, et il s'agit d'envisager une machine qui fonctionne. Cette machine-là n'est pas de l'objet. On peut la rendre objet, on peut l'objectiver. Mais elle-même, elle est active, elle n'est pas proportionnelle, on peut la rendre proportionnelle, elle n'est pas l'ordre de l'objet, on peut l'objectiver, mais c'est peut-être ça, j'en sais rien.
Je sais, Volodya Voevodsky, lui, peut-être lui plutôt appellerait ça structure. Il n'a pas publié très beau commentaire sur Proclus. Sur les commentaires de Proclus sur définition de deux angles. Parce que il y a, peut-être tu te rappelles, il y a eu en discussion, est-ce que l'angle c'est relation, blablabla. Et il donne Proclus, exemple très, très intéressant, il dit que si ça peut être, ce n'est pas relation entre les côtés, parce que ça peut être angle plan, mais ça peut être une partie de conique, un truc comme ça. Et donc, Volodya, lui, il a utilisé ça pour dire que dans ce cadre classique, on remplace, on toujours pense de relation, encore dans le terme de vérité. Parce qu'il y a relation, il n'y a pas relation. Donc, il n'y a que deux possibilités, oui et non. Donc, c'est propositionnel dans ce sens-là. Tu vois? Tant que dans, je sais pas, le vrai géométrie, ça doit être plusieurs, tu vois, c'est pas vrai ou faux, mais ça peut être son structure qui a plein de trucs dedans, pas juste oui ou non. Donc oui, mais moi je pense le mot objet c'est bien ici, parce que si on peut revient à cette discussion, je dis de Cassirer, etc., de qu'est-ce qu'un objet. Et donc, à mon avis, c'est objet.
J'ai une question, peut-être je vais demander en anglais. For geometry, the axioms of Euclid work, but there is no axiomatization of arithmetic in Euclid. But for Hilbert, there is axiomatization of arithmetic very much from the beginning. So do you think there is something special about geometry that permits the kind of Euclidean approach for which there is a failure for arithmetic?
Well, first of all, when you say there is no axiomatization for arithmetic, I think, you should more precisely, there are axioms, common notions, they work for arithmetic, and they're used in arithmetical books, of course, right? What indeed there is absent from Euclid is arithmetical postulates. Even, I think you may kind of imagine them, I think, rather easily. Right. So in that sense, and accordingly, every arithmetical proposition in Euclid is formally theorem. There is no arithmetical problems. That's rather strange. I mean, formally, by this ending, what quadrant demonstrandum, right? There is no what quadrant facendo. Even if certain things very much look like problems.
You have problems in the arithmetical books.
Yeah?
Yeah, to find the greatest common divisor.
Yeah, but look how it ends up.
Yes, if you
I think they all ends up that way. And that's kind of strange, yeah. One explanation, it's kind of Platonic, right? You find it in Proclus, that arithmetics is all closer and upper there, so it should be all theorem and not involve any. But no, for something like that. But still, as David say, somehow there are problems. So I would say it's rather not very coherent. I would add postulates. If I were Euclid, I would add arithmetic. And I don't think there is a kind of profound, as you're saying, difference between. It's rather historical. No, between arithmetic and geometry in that sense. So you're right. Hilbert treats arithmetic the same way as he treats geometry, right? And I do believe that if we are not happy with that and want this broader constructive notion and include, we also should include arithmetic there. So it's not something specific. No, at least that's I did not try.
So I also have a question about something that you alluded to, and you said maybe you could talk about it, because I think I will disagree with you. It's with Aristotle and Aristotle logic, because you made allusion to the fact that there was some kind of a continuity between Euclidean setting and kind of Aristotle logic, and in a way I would say that the one who invented the idea that logic was propositional and put everything into a propositional context is Aristotle. I mean, yes, it's a classical problem that, in a way, precisely it doesn't fit.
But we are in agreement with
yeah, but you say that there was some kind of mathematical logic in Euclid that was in continuity with Aristotle.
I'll show you.
Where I have the impression that there is no continuity. That is to say that Aristotle had a certain idea on logic.
It is, but it is kind of different. Yeah. Look, that's so first principles, right? And he says common opinions, but I take it's the same as common annoyance, common doxas, on which all men base their demonstration. And here that's logical, like non-contradiction, right? So he just says what are this, and this is evidence, because if we say here he refers to something like Euclidean axioms, right? And but he describes them more generally, already as logical principles. So it's kind of linked. But that's let's first comparison, what I call comparison mathematical and logical axioms. And logical axioms, again, those are rules of inference here, like perfect syllogism. So they are not axioms in our usual sense. So we have now to say whether it is up to the same science or to different sciences to inquire into what in mathematics is called axioms, and into the general issue of essence. Clearly, the inquiry into these things is up to the same science, namely science of the philosopher, roughly this first philosophy, logic and metaphysics. For axioms hold of everything that there is, but not of some particular genus apart from others. Everyone makes use of them because they concern being qua being, and each genus concern being qua being. But men use them just so far as sufficient for their purpose, that is, within the limits of the genus relevant to their proof. So you see, no, in my sense, what he is doing here, again, common notions, they are common for arithmetic and geometry, but for Aristotle, it's not enough. He just makes something similar, but broader.
No, but I think that this is precisely the capture into a propositional form. That is to say that there is another science, which is logic, which is done by the philosopher and not the mathematician.
Yeah, and he just refers to mathematics and which kind of proof. Right, there is nothing like postulates there.
Yes, not only that, I mean, there is really this idea that the analytics are giving a propositional form to something which is a general theory of science, which is logic. And so, in my view, Aristotle invented what you want to oppose. That is to say, the capture of everything into a propositional form, even if it did not work with the mathematics. He pretended, he claimed it was the case.
It's exactly my point. It's exactly my point. But when only one edition, what my claim is only that. When he invented that, right, it did not invent it just from nothing. And he used as motivation, like axioms, these mathematical axioms. And of course, he could see that only axioms are not sufficient, right? You need postulates, maybe you need something. So, but kind of prototype from what you just described for mathematical axioms.
Yeah.
That's the, and I think it's rather clear. He actually, you see, he refers to like Euclid's axiom, which of course earlier than Euclid.
Okay, so I misunderstood this. And my other question was precisely about the relationship between postulate and definition. That is to say, the answer to the question on the circle. Because I have the impression that you emphasize too much the non-propositional aspect of Euclid's elements. It seems that you need always to have a mixture.
Yeah, no, that's what I'm saying.
And so sometimes you will rely on postulate, but sometimes you will rely on definition.
Right.
Yeah. And so the definitional part will be purely semantic.
No, here you agree. And I just take this form. You see? No, it's a mixture, but I actually would like better understand how, how it mixed, how it works. Because, right, formally speaking, here you have just this propositional thing here, right? And here you have purely non-proposition. But every time you need both, even in very simple problem and theorem. No, Proclus actually remarks that in some theorems you don't need that, kind of trivial, right? And for him this is an advantage. But basically you need both. Only when it's a theorem we say that construction kind of helps your proof, right? And if you're in problem, you say that proof helps your construction. So, but that's of course, you may just forget what helps what, but look at the structure. And structure is kind of carry over. So indeed you need both things every time.
Yes, but what about the a reading like that of Manders, in which you claim that the first step is related to a kind of information which is carried by the diagram, and the third step is carried by the text itself. That means that when you do a precise analysis of the content of these two steps, they don't concern the same kind of properties. And that's a good way to explain why you always this and why you have a mixture. And what happens is that then when people want to formalize this, what they do, either they do it completely constructively and they lose.
No, I think my reading is different from this, essay in which, because if I understand I read his paper correctly, he says that this diagrams is kind of package, is a way to communicate propositional content. And that's I disagree. I think it's not a way to communicate propositional content. There is really non-propositional.
You mean in Manders? Manders, no. Manders completely disagree with any propositional content. All his idea, this is what he calls semantic failure. But he has only a proof theoretical reading of both sides, and that you say you only need rules. So it's very close to what you claim. And in fact, I think he goes too far. Because sometimes with definition you need a content, and that he denied this. And so
maybe it's not Manders, but John, whom I remember.
No, John is different, but in Manders, Manders has very strong claim about the fact that you have to get rid of any semantics. Everything can be interpreted into two systems of proofs that are combined. And you need the construction step because in many cases, not all the cases, but in many, and then it starts to be some kind of a usual way to do it, since in many cases you need it, you will do it all the time. In many cases you need to infer things from the diagram itself. And this inferential step cannot be carried by the text in and of itself, because the text is ruled by the axioms. That is to say that in the text you deal only with equalities, inequalities, parts and whole.
Construction is also a text.
Huh?
Construction is.
No, construction describes something that you are doing somewhere else. And there is a whole argument about something that construction is not a text. Construction is describing something that you have to do somewhere else. And there are many arguments in Manders and in Nets on the fact that sometimes if you don't have this material proxy here, you simply cannot perform the proof. Either because you have over specification or under determination, or simply because it's way too complicated. Right. The situation is way too complicated. So the construction is not just a text. It's a text about an artifact, which is not an object, it's an artifact. And the whole claim of Manders is that this artifact is a bearer of inferences. It's not an object, it's a bearer of some inferences. And this is what the role he plays in the book. And that will give you an explanation of this mixture.
But I would say, look, I would say that it's also important to see this as a text. Also, right. Of course you have,
it is a text
and that's you want.
I'll
tell you why. Because that gives you this generality of rules. Here you combine rules and apply rules. You see, if you just have a diagram, it's an instance, right? And instance, of course, important. It's also important here to have instance. It begins here. This instantiation is all the way important, right? But it's also important to have this, understand that your instance is instance of something more general. And here you have this more general, but not in prepositional form, but in form of use. You see, like in Kant, you say in general what to do, and you can make it with this instance, with another instance, with one diagram, with another. That's why you see, I wouldn't say that it's just in essential. You may drop it and replace by a diagram. I don't think so.
No, but that's not the point. The point is that this step is related. It's a text on a diagram.
Right.
And what this step is, it's describing the way that you're constructing generically, you're absolutely right, a diagram according to the postulate. Where the proof will be a mixture of two things. You will have derived proposition which obey to the axiom, and information coming from the diagram that are not derivable from the axiom. Yeah. And that will give you an explanation of this kind of mixture between construction and semantics. I mean, it's a very specific thing.
But how this kind of analysis would apply to problems? Because now it's still, you explain how a theorem works, right? Yeah. That you need this, that's Yakov Hindikov more or less the same. You need this additional input. Otherwise you can't obtain input, right? But I rather think that you should
that
also
apply to with
problem
and theorems. That has to do with the kind of inferences that are allowed or not. That is to say that, for example, if you want to know that some part of a figure is inside another part of figure, there is no way you can infer this from a purely textual background. So you need to have a situation which is in front of you in which you see that one part is inside another side.
But look, but in this, I agree, but in this analysis, still the issue of inference is central, right? You wonder how you make inference, and you find it, and that's okay. But my point is that think about problem. The structure is the same, so everything you say, except certain accents, right, is the same. And then you would turn it the other way around. You say, I cannot construct without these inferences. I kind of use inferences to construct. The other way around.
No, but I don't think this. I don't think this is the question. The question is not about what you need to do the construction or to need the proof. Is the fact that when you look at the structure of the proof, you realize that some information are given by the diagrams and some not. That's all.
But
and that works in problems and in theorems.
Question, David, by information, do you mean propositional content?
No, that's the point. The point is that you can analyze this only in terms of rules of inferences. Some rules of inferences are allowed by the artifact itself, and some are allowed in the text by the...
But inference is a logical inference proposition from proposition, something else.
Yeah, it's a kind of logical inferences from proposition to proposition, if you want, because you transcribe it into a text.
But in that case, in order to make any input into propositional rule, this rule of inference, right, you do need that what you input has propositional form. Right?
That's not true. I mean, when in the part of the construction, you have letters. These letters are neither variables. They are not a concept.
Maybe
they're
we are
not
talking
objects.
about the same thing. But my point is exactly that. Of course, you do have this.
But it's not an objection. Huh? It's just the fact that it gives an explanation of the strange mixture that you are fighting with. It gives a nice way to explain this mixture.
No, maybe it is an explanation, but I would say we need more explanation. Because that's only explained from this propositional side, how it's possible, how we get certain propositions which otherwise are not inferable, right? And answer is, okay, we get these premises just directly from diagram, right? That's more or less.
Well, but here I don't follow you, because at the end of the day, an Euclidean proof is a set of propositions. I mean, I don't understand what you are here objecting to to Munder's point. If you're saying that at some point I have to translate it into relation between proposition, I don't see how you can get rid of this.
No, look, my point is exactly that. Of course, we have propositions there, right?
So what is the objection to Munder's point of view?
My point is that we have non-propositional content in Euclid.
Yes.
Which is...
and you agree with this?
No,
you agree completely with this?
Right.
No.
Right. So no, I take seriously this idea that we produce something like regular...
But that's exactly the idea. You look at the diagram, which is not a proposition, and you have some ways to behave with the diagram, which are not proposition in themselves, they are ways of doing. This is what you show. And from this, you have rules. You can translate it into relation between propositions, but they are not propositions. So I have the impression that you agree, both. So it's. I think it's compatible with what you're saying here. The question is not that at the end of the day you have a relation between propositions, because the question is, if I understood you well, do I have a propositional content everywhere? And Munders is very clear about no, and no. I mean, this is what he calls semantic failure. Semantic failure just means that precisely. You have to look, because it's interesting. And one of his arguments is precisely based on reductio, because in case of reductio, the propositional content is a contradiction. So this is the end of the proof. The beginning is the end. And so he says, of course, it's not a propositional content. It's things that I'm doing, and then I derive a contradiction in the text, which is very interesting. Because if the propositional context was in the diagram, immediately the contradiction will show up. This is your argument about P and non-P, and it will be the end of the demonstration. And he says, no, this is the beginning. I have a construction, and then I translate it into a contradiction, and since the contradiction is not allowed, I can say, no, my initial proposition was false. And it's very interesting.
I actually didn't look much into that's...
But in fact, I think that Munders is going too far, because he wants no semantic at all. And the problem is that if you do this, you cannot understand the rules of definition. So in his view, definitions are useless. Full dot. And it's true that many definitions are useless. That it is very well known. For example, the definition of the point is useless. You never use it. The definition of the straight line is useless. You never use it in any demonstration. But then there are other definitions, like the circle, as you say, that seems not dispensable.
I think here is evidence why definition not used, because otherwise you wouldn't need this proof, right? Why you would need
to?
No, that proof in problem 1, right?
Yeah.
You made your construction and then you prove that what you made is what you say.
No.
But that, what you made, what you say, it's correspondence to the definition. What can be else?
Yeah.
So here I agree. We don't just say this construction is a definition. We constructed something and say, enjoy it. But we have definition beforehand, and then we construct, and then we check if
it's
fit
a
or not.
definition.
Of
Yeah.
course.
And this part is semantics.
Right.
You're obliged to have this semantical part. Because
But
definitions are
what I'm not
rules of
sure
inferences.
that whether for making sense of this proof and of that semantic, we should really say assume triangles exist. Perhaps we may just have definition without.
That's another issue. The question of
Yeah.
existence is a
Yeah.
completely different issue.
Yeah.
It's a philosophical issue about
Yeah.
what means existing in mathematics
Yeah.
and so on, and we don't have any evidence about this before Proclus. I mean, they simply don't talk about it. This is what Netz says that. He says, in fact, they didn't care about this because their only existing object was the diagram. And so he says, and when people will come and ask them questions about their ontology, there is a beautiful passage that they will mumble something about the weather and continue their job. You know, I will give you this quote. So he has decided that everything was done precisely to escape these ontological questions. You don't need to address them. And we have, and his argument is that we have absolutely no testimony of mathematicians discussing about this before 8 centuries after Euclid, which is interesting. I mean, he has an argument about the kind of ascetic discipline of what mathematics was for the Greek guys, compared to philosophy, poetry, and so on. And this is a good claim. This is a good claim. Because if you compare with physics and all of this other knowledge, you had many discussions. So, yes, I will send you the quote, but it's a side issue. It's a side issue. Other questions?
I have just one question about your goal. I mean, your goal is to your goal. What you have in mind. Is it to put forward a non-propositional view of logic, or is it to get a combination of axiomatic method and constructive, in a broad sense, constructive approach? And if in the latter case, what are your examples? So that's the question I ask you. I mean, apart from homotopy theory, although I don't think, I mean, it is a good instance of that, and apart maybe from Euclid, because maybe it's one example of combination, but of the axiomatic and constructive approaches. So, what examples do you have in mind, existing or possible?
No, I think really a lot. And, as I mentioned, I didn't study that sufficiently and have no time to talk. But I think there is a long tradition. It sounds like geometrical calculus, geometrical characteristics, which is all based on this kind of how to say, as you say, combination of logic and object or construction. So many things in the 17th century, which Leibniz of course had in mind, somehow they enter and could be given as examples, not just examples of the two things being present at least. And second question, of course, how they. Very interesting example, which I would like to understand better, is Peano's book on Grassmann. You know, his little book, it's translated into English. His rendering of Grassmann's rendering of Leibniz. It's very interesting. And then you have more or less this Grassmann calculus, right, vectors, but very small, like 0 chapter, is propositional logic. And then very interesting question, what role of this chapter, you know? Because it's not like it just, like in Hilbert axiomatics, you have some background logic which you use for developing everything else. It's much more, looks like it's kind of 0 level vector or something, proposition. So it's not very clear and thought for. But I think examples like this are really, really abound. And talking about this Euclid form, as I say, I think it's pretty much alive in today's mathematics, at least on this teaching level. Because, as my example from this Kolmogorov forming textbook, I mean, you have some kind of construction. Even another my example was from Bourbaki. I didn't have time. I actually took a draft version from archive and what was finally published. And in draft version, it's really, you have not something like power set, right? Of course, in official setting, it's an axiom, right? It's existential claim that exists. But in say practice on this, you may read it as a postulate, just giving a set, produce it, power set. So without this existential commitment, but just as something like Euclid's postulate. And I think
my point is there are two different ways of combining two things. Either you have the two things and you combine them actually, or you have two things because you can look at the same thing in two different ways. And of course, if combining amounts to looking at the same thing in two different ways, of course there are many examples. Like lambda calculus is a way of looking at proofs as being objects, and but you can look at proofs in another way, and of course it's a combination, but it's a very easy one, and of course you have that throughout everywhere. I mean everywhere throughout the whole history of logic. But my point is, do you really have examples of a strong combination where you have, because in your Grassmann example or your Peano example, then you just look at propositions as being zero-dimensional vectors, but it's not like having propositions and vectors combined together.
Yeah. No, I think in Peano maybe we should look more precisely because we have something.
No, that's just an example. But I just my question is, do you have examples?
Of course not, because just in a sense logic is not his problem. No, I mean formal logic. Even they talk about that. So no, perhaps in that sense, homotopy theory is the only example. And but even in homotopy theory, I think there are many things to discuss. What really, because there are actually some competing proposals, what really to call propositional type, and what no, I'll talk with that later. So, but I think kind of general, approach. It's not very special for homotopy type theory. I mean, it looks like it's really comes back to Euclid. So from that point of view, it looks like this Hilbertian view is rather special, and it looks like in this later work he recognized that. You see that. Simply, my moral, you shouldn't take it as a kind of canonical standard understanding what is a theory. It's just special way to represent a theory, useful for some particular purposes, like these meta theorems, and not useful for other purposes, and you should not take it for granted. And of course, hope is to use this to make something like practical axiomatic method, that we finally can give formal proofs and use computer to check them and stuff like that. So, and it's interesting that it closer to something real today, right? In that kind of epistemological setting rather than in purely proposition. It's kind of less kind of evidence for saying that in real mathematics, you see, it's not all proposition.
Yeah, but you could also think of mathematics like Cartesian geometry or differential calculus. They are not axiomatized, so that's not exactly the same, but they are closer to Euclid than to Hilbert for sure. And if you accept that they are theories, for example, for Descartes, that was la géométrie, so in a way, and you have this role of non-propositional content and the fact that theory is not based on derivation of proposition and so on. And we have examples, like two examples in which you can show this. You can show even disagreement, very interesting, in which you have one actor saying, doing everything on the propositional content, and the other guy says, what are you doing this way? I mean, we can do it. So the basic example is the one that Sebastian always brings, which is the discussion between Descartes and Queen Elizabeth, where she will do it only with formulas, deriving algebraic formulas, and Descartes will say, oh no, look at the diagram, you have this and this relationship, and you just set up the equation according to your, and then you work with this double system in which you have all of this. So one part is non-propositional in the sense of Manders. I don't know if it's exactly the same idea, but you have one part that you need to have by some kind of postulate that are not very explicit in Descartes, but you can make them explicit.
But what you and maybe Manders mean by non-propositional?
But in this case, it's just a part of the theory that are given by some rules of construction, okay, and that you cannot you never explain them or you cannot render them into a propositional form, and you use them directly as rules of construction, and then you go back into the proposition that you have this circuit. So that will be the idea. So it's not exactly the same than you, but I think it goes in the same direction. And it's the same idea that it's based on rules, some kind of rules. So Marco's point is that Descartes' geometry is a pure continuation of Euclid's geometry because it's just enlarging the rules of construction to a larger class of objects. So in this sense, you have other examples, but they are not axiomatized. That's another issue. So you can make them axiomatized. That's exactly Marco's point. But people like Descartes, they will hate axiomatics. So that's another question. And Leibniz is complicated. He loves axiomatic, but
in some sense you have the same in Frege, where the distribution with the strings, they are not called strings, like the lines, where he writes the different propositions, which he calls the logical content of it, which is not propositional. He says if you see that you're seeing he doesn't exactly say like this, but basically the scope of the quantifiers, and this is some logical content which is not propositional, which you cannot put in propositional form, and which you lose when you go to Peano's writing, and he expresses his discontent with this other transformation because the scope of it is not directly seen as such, and that's part of an axiomatized theory. So you have both there, and then it will come axiomatized when they are going to discuss like the scopes of quantifiers later, starting with Hintica, and then of course the types. And
actually, in Frege it goes also back to this question: intension, intensius, extension. Right?
Yeah, but this is something else, because this is something that is about the propositions. But you cannot put in propositional form. I mean, the structure that holds the propositions and guides the inference itself is written, is drawn, and it's not in a propositional form. And he holds to this idea. He puts it in a, like knowing that that's its role. So
by the way, this. Of course, high order structure in Martin Löf is only permitted when it's not extensional theory.
Yeah.
So if you have this extensionality, it's all cut.
Yeah.
Immediately.
Sure.
Okay, but the examples, I mean, just show that there's a combination of formal and informal reasonings, or axiomatic and diagrammatic reasoning. I mean, that's one thing that is well known, but it's another thing to get a combination within an axiomatic framework of what you call, within a formal framework, within a single formal framework, what you call axiomatic and constructive. It's something completely different.
Yeah. No, exactly.
And I just would like to have an idea of
exactly. I would like to really dissociate this question of formal and informal from what I'm talking about. So the claim is that this non-propositional can make formal. But further, and here I'm not quite sure, because I think you asked whether it would be logical form or not. And here I'm not sure, because it depends, of course, how you think about what is logical.
Logical, because,
No, here at White, if you say, right, that logic is not only about deriving proposition from some other proposition, but as Kant said, right, for him, logic, transcendental so-called, it's about building objects. So if you think about logic in this broad enough sense, then yes, you may call it logical. But if you don't, you should say it's a formal but not logical. No, I don't know, perhaps better call it logical. But insisting that logic is not just about being true or false, right? It's about this object building as well.
But in the case of Descartes and Leibniz, it's not a question of being formal or informal. You have not one side which is formal and the other which is informal, or both sides are equally formal or informal. Choose your camp, but it's not the question. And you can make it formal. It's not. I mean, especially in Leibniz, for example, Descartes hated formal reasoning, so that's another issue. So he didn't do it. But you have people who try to write handbooks and formalize it. So it looks like kind of what could be done as formal theory at that time, which is of course
look. I would say Descartes did things formally, but what he hated it's this notion of this narrow notion of logical form, rather that, right? But if you think about formal as I don't know, following fixed system of rules, of course, all this rules about. Algebraic rules.
Descartes really hated that. He was very clear because all of this is synthetical. Euclid is merely synthetical, and according to Descartes, synthetic is what you do when you have done the analysis, which is the most important part. And the analysis is not formal in this sense. You can render it formal, you can do it, but according to Descartes, it's an idiosyncrasy in Descartes. He thought that was for poor guy who just had nothing else to do than to write the discoveries that were made by great men. So that is a fixed idea.
But that really depends what we call formal. But if, as Descartes, right, he does his analysis by, say, transformation of formula, right?
Yeah.
By why it's not formal, it is formal in that sense.
Yeah,
so
it's another sense that was used.
You have rules of how you play with the formulas, fixed rules. And
if you take Euclid's model as a certain idea of formality, it's purely synthetical. You have first the definition, the postulate, the axiom, then the first proposition, and then you build on this. If you take this as being one model of what a formal theory is, contrasted to informal practice and so on, Descartes will hate the formal theory. Then if you call formal the use of formulas and so on, it's another issue. Because you can use formulas even if you're doing analysis in Greek. So it's different. But I was just answering to Brice. Not you can argue that Descartes is formal. That's not my problem. But he was very particular when it comes to the axiomatic method. That's for absolutely explicit, and he hated it and so on. But if you look at Leibniz, he loved it. He did. He did many samples, like Characteristica, Geometrica, and all of this, and so on. And here you can see that you can. It's not a question. What I just want to say is not a question of formal, informal.
I agree.
Other questions? Discussion? So it's time to eat. To continue.
Thank you very much.
No, thank you.
J'ai des questions pour toi, mais c'est ce que tu as dit, c'est pas sûr.